in the Graduate School of Interdisciplinary Information Studies at the University of Tokyo. I'm a historian by training, and I've been always interested in social minorities and how they are made to become social minorities by various social institutions, what kind of methods are used or tactics are used to exclude, and also what kind of methods and tactics are used to regain agency. In terms of my work, my teaching at this university, I'm involved in the Global Leadership Program, which is a university-wide honors program and for undergraduate students. And we spend a lot of time actually talking about DEI. And also, I'm also involved in a AI project about how artificial intelligence can be used in a way that is not always great. So that what are the social implications for social minorities? These are the kinds of things that I'm currently working on. Thank you so much for having me, Mark. And I appreciate Cecilia for all your work in organizing this event. Looking forward to learning from everybody as well. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Okay, next up we have Julia Lilly-Becker. Julia?
So good morning from myself, Julia, and good evening to you, or whatever the positionality is that you are across the globe. Thank you, Mark, and the university for inviting myself and my colleague to join this presentation. Yes, it's curious to have a conversation around these issues. And certainly as a mother, a lecturer, a wife, a white woman, I come from different positions of privilege. But also in my journey, as I've been working for 40 years in special education, I've recognized the number of disparities that occur both within the education and across society. And I think by opening our eyes and asking more pertinent questions, we might be able to be more responsive and reactive to the needs as they arise in our changing and challenging times. So I bring some insight about special education, about working in different contexts, and also about the positionality that I have and whether my views are worth hearing or worth challenging. So I'll be welcoming questions back. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And lastly, but certainly not least, Alison Taylor. Alison, if you don't mind.
Good morning and good evening. Firstly, I'm delighted to be here, so thank you very much for the invitation. I'm a lecturer here on the Special Educational Needs, Disability and Inclusion course here at Bishop Grosseteste University. Previously to my work here, I have worked very much as a practitioner in education with a specialism in autism, working as an advisory teacher. And my interest currently is very much about the student experience, the university experience for the students that I work with day in, day out on our current course. So I'm interested about the impact of action research and community change. And I hope today that I can bring something to the conversation, not only my own views, but some of the views that I've collected from the students that I collaborate with. So thank you very much for having me.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much again to all of our panelists, and I look forward to our conversation. So jumping right in, I have a lot of questions that I was hoping to ask everyone today. We'll see if we can get to all of them. But for right now, one point that I wanted to start us off with, which is one kind of near and dear to my heart as a disabled individual, a wheelchair user, an international student, and now international researcher and professor working at a university, is where the boundaries of a inclusive learning environment are. So for me, just thinking personally for a moment, I know that when I moved to Japan for the first time to study, I was able to find housing via my university. I was able to find a train route to my school with the help of my academic administrators. And I was able to get support on campus whether it was modifying the classroom to accommodate my wheelchair or to be able to support my needs as someone who, at the time, back in 2008, didn't speak Japanese all that well. So I was able to get support in some types of spaces. But there were many other parts of my experience as a student that were not necessarily as well included or covered by university accommodations. And I'll give you an example here. When I would leave my dorm room or my train route to go to the supermarket, to hang out with my friends or participate in activities, club events that were outside of the structured university space, it was very difficult for me to find accessible features. So getting access to groceries was a problem. Getting access to sporting events with friends was an issue. And with these type of questions in mind, or with these type of ideas in mind, one question that I want to start us off with is just thinking about where are the physical or environmental boundaries around inclusion for the university? Because going to school is far more than sitting in a classroom. It's going to a library. It's having a living environment. It's being able to navigate from one space to the next. So I'm curious from each of your perspectives as individuals working in the DEI space, that is diversity, equity, and inclusion. Where do you think the boundaries of university inclusion or university responsibility might be, should be, in terms of accommodating the members of our communities? So I'll ask that question. If anyone would like to respond, I'll ask that you please raise your hand or indicate some other way. Julia, go ahead.
Okay. So in response, really, your question provokes for me the reflection upon what do we mean by university. And I think we need to track back a little bit before we say what are the spaces that fulfill that definition, to think what do we mean by learning. And in my experience working within a university setting, it's not about a 3-year or 1-year course which has a destination in mind. It's about a broad understanding of differences and tolerance and acceptance. So I think we've got a systematic failure really certainly within the UK system, that our sense of learning is bound by an appreciation of only cognitive competence as opposed to a situational understanding of differences that an individual encounters. So your exploration offered us some reflections upon the boundaries that you are, or the barriers that you are physically encountering. But I think we need to go a lot deeper into that to say what is it we're actually offering beyond that place. And I think that nature of learning that is embracive of differences has to be cognizant really of both the context in which that learning is taking place and the timing, the temporal nature of that moment. So as we're learning and changing, hopefully in a positive direction, I think we've got to be constantly revisiting what do we mean by learning, as well as the place in which that is occurring. So I'll pause for a moment because I could go on.
Well, thanks so much. It looks like Allison wants to chime in as well.
I believe that these boundaries that are experienced often occur even before they arrive at university, and with some of my conversations with students, the uncertainty about what the university experience will hold for them is sometimes a barrier in itself, because it's not always transparent as to what a university experience will be like. And so the support is really required before they even come to us, I believe, so that it can be more predictable, and they can be aware that they are going to be supported in a way that will match their needs. And I think akin to that is the anxiety that comes with it. And when that anxiety builds from the unpredictable nature of what the university experience will be, then so perhaps that begins to restrict their confidence to engage in particular aspects of university life. And so it almost gets limited and restricted down from before they even are welcomed into the university. And so I think when we consider boundaries, we don't just consider the physical boundaries or the boundaries of the environment, but to consider the emotional and well-being boundaries that can begin very early on.
Yeah, well, let's see. I think I saw Itasu set his hand first. So if you don't mind.
Thank you. So I think this is a really interesting question, and it's a very difficult one as well. I'm going to admit from the get-go that I'm no expert on this, but I'm guessing that when we talk about the university's responsibility, if we can somehow unpack it, I think that might be helpful, at least for me to be able to understand what needs to happen. So in this particular case, for example, if the university is able to identify the obstacles that might exist for a student to come to university, I think that's very useful and important. And then to acknowledge that these are obstacles, I think that's also very important and possible. But I'm really not quite sure what the university can do in order to stop that from being an obstacle. Or, you know, when we say responsibility, what does that exactly entail is my question.
I think that's a great question. Aurora, you want to chime in here?
Yeah, I suppose I'd like to echo a little bit of what Yuko is saying in terms of, like, before we can really set up boundaries, we have to first do the research to even start imagining where the help is needed and what can be provided. I mean, you know, we have these events because we're learning all the time about these things that we don't know due to our privilege. And, you know, our institutions are set up and designed for, you know, originally designed for like heterosexual, male, monolingual Japanese students in Japan. And so, you know, there's so many things that we need to actually do the research first.
Absolutely. And there's a lot to say on that point. Before I start chiming in, Julia, I think you've got something to add.
I think that was a very pertinent point by Aurora, that one of the elements, and links back to Yuko's comment, what is the responsibility? And we use the word safety. And if we're encouraging students to come and take risks to learn with us, then one of the responsibilities, I think, is that we are mindful of the environment that enables them to be successful learners without endangering themselves due to a number of unexpected obstacles. So yes, around sexuality, about gender, around race, certainly in our predominantly white community that we are in Lincolnshire in the UK, we have to explore what these issues are, but also ensure that in our exploration we're not over promoting at the risk of somebody not being successful by being a student with us. Yeah.
Alison, if you want to jump in on that.
Sorry, just had to unmute. I think when we look at the agenda of widening participation and opening our doors and welcoming a more diverse student population into our universities in order to study and have that holistic experience, I think we need to, our responsibility needs to be to meeting those students' needs, because we have welcomed them into, if not drawn them into our universities. And if we think these might be students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, students with disabilities, students of race, the full diversity, these are also students that may have had a much more challenging journey up until the point of admission. And so from that point of view, the responsibility for their safety, as Julia says, can't be switched on and off. It needs to be provided 24 hours because mental health issues might be more prevalent. And I think if we are prepared to take their money, bring them into study, offer them the same opportunities, we need to make sure that we are meeting their needs, because our expectation of society is to shift towards inclusion, and therefore we should also be reflecting that.
Absolutely, thank you so much. I want to pause our conversation for 1 minute here and kind of reflect on two themes that I see coming out. The first of which is there are what I'll call pipeline problems. There are barriers to getting students into the university or settled into the university that stem from outside. So it could be barriers at the level of high school, for instance, barriers at the level of middle school, barriers in the environment that prevent access to qualifications or access to resources that would then make the university experience more accessible and more inclusive. And to understand those barriers, whether they are before the entrance exam or after someone has entered university, we need to do more research, and we need to understand exactly what types of diversity, what types of problems are out there, so that we can begin to work on these problems. So we have the recognition that barriers start before the university and continue to affect the university. The understanding that we need more research to understand that process. But this begets another question from me, and that's, well, okay, if we understand there are barriers on the outside, we understand we need to look at them, who should be the one researching these issues? Is this a matter of professors to go and research what social problems are out there? Is this a matter of academic administrators who should be the ones active on it by setting up accommodations plans? Is this a matter of engaging high schools to think about transition plans going upward? Is this a matter of speaking with local business owners and people around university settings who might be involved in creating a more inclusive environment for students and professors alike to interact in? You know, there's a question around who should be the ones doing this research or generating this awareness around diversity. And I'm curious, I'm sure to some extent everyone has some responsibility, but if you have any thoughts around what this research process or what this process of recognizing barriers might look like from your own perspectives, I'd be curious to hear. I see everyone's hands. All right, why don't we start with Yuko? I see you first.
Okay, thank you. I suppose, yeah, I agree with Mark. It has to happen in all different areas. It's a multi, all the stakeholders somehow need to be involved, and I don't know whether it should just be the responsibility of one kind of stakeholder over another. But I think what I'm really encouraged about in our local context is that the students have really started to talk about this in their own, whether they're creating new student circles or whether they're doing some kind of research group or having workshops for other students, for their peers. I've seen this happening more often, I suppose, in recent years, and I'm very much encouraged by that. I think there are professors who also do research on this, but I think I don't know whether there's an increasing number of professors who are doing this, but I think there's at least some dialogue that's starting to happen in our student community, which is very much encouraging for me.
Thanks so much. Aurora.
Yeah, again, I think I would agree that there's so much that we can learn from students. I mean, we have amazing student groups here on campus, like Totoko, and towards diversity, Women Empowered International, and you know, a lot of them, they have done a lot of research already. So yeah, I just love going to see their presentations and, you know, working with them. I would say also in terms of, you know, from a university admin level, I think an area that is just very important for all universities really is to have experts in diversity, exclusion, equity, inclusion that are permanent in the university and able to address like varied different issues related to the varied concerns of our diverse students. I think that, you know, they have to be permanent because if they're not, then there's a lot of, you know, power differences when trying to resolve conflict and issues related to, you know, things that come up with students, with faculty. And also, you know, if we don't have experts on staff, then a lot of this DEI work is pushed to, of course, you know, minority faculty who have to do it as volunteer work. And then, you know, sometimes, you know, they are not able to make enough money to continue doing diversity and inclusion work. So it just doesn't become a source of, there's just no incentive to really keep doing the work, and it's disheartening. So yeah, anyway, just to reiterate, hiring experts in DEI, I think, is very important for universities.
Thank you for that. And I totally agree. I mean, there are, as you mentioned, power differentials. There's questions around institutional memory. So if we hire someone and then have an immediate turnover, ongoing DEI initiatives may fall by the wayside. There's a lot of problems there. And this connects to another topic I want to bring up, which is we begin these processes of bringing stakeholders together. But before we get there, I see Julia has her hand up, but I want to call attention to that. So Julia, you have something to add?
Yeah, I'll try to be brief because, of course, we're suddenly halfway through our discussion and there's lots more to cover. And again, I'm mindful of my own position in responding to this, but it's what would the research enable us to do differently? So before we start asking who does the research, what would be the answers we would be hoping? Would we wanting to find something different to that which we already suspect is happening, i.e. that young people are not coming through to university because of a number of reasons? And again, I can offer a number of explanations for that based upon my own experience. Not least, a student at Christmas sent me an email saying, "Thank you, you've made my experience here excellent. I've just started in September. I was terrified," is what Alison said, "of coming to university, and I realized it's not that scary a place after all." So it's not only who does the research, but what are the answers we're trying to answer that we don't already know. And if we're trying to generate data, then where does that data go to? And the responsibility then is how we use that information to create change. So are we looking at change that comes across societal attitudes and values, or are we saying it's got to be driven by legislation? And certainly within the UK, we've got particular legislation that talks about entitlement, about protected characteristics. But that for all the paper that comes out of that, unless it makes a difference within the communities that people are learning in, then the research is just going to sit on a shelf. So it's the intention of that research alongside the collaboration to get the answers that actually can create a difference. I'll close now.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a common phrase that I use pretty often, which is, you know, engaging in practice or engaging in activism or advocacy without research can be misguided and dangerous. We can end up hurting conditions for someone that we're trying to help. Meanwhile, engaging in research without activism, advocacy, practice can be kind of pointless. We're not necessarily mobilizing that data in service of inclusion. So there's this real need to connect our research with our practice and think about that very critically. But before, again, we jump too far down that rabbit hole, I see Allison's hand. So Allison, you something to add?
Hello, just briefly, I think when we're considering the need for research and deeper understanding, I think sometimes institutions will rely more on a monitoring kind of approach, and that the monitoring is often very numbers driven, so that they might get a picture, a numerical picture of what's happening at the moment across the different groups of diversity. But actually, if you're purely using those numbers and oversimplified bar graphs, then to be honest, we're losing the narratives of individual experience. And I think without those, you're missing opportunities to understand what's actually happening, as Julia says, in the reality of accessing university and higher education. So I think we need to be very careful that institutions don't just use sort of tokenistic monitoring methods, but that they're actually going deeper than that.
Absolutely, thank you so much. I mean, the qualitative versus the quantitative, for lack of a better term, is incredibly important here to think not just about numbers, but about what those numbers represent, who may or may not be represented inside of those numbers, and then how we mobilize them and towards what purpose. So many questions that we would need to be looking at in relation to particular contexts of particular individuals in particular circumstances. And I'm sure that would look different from the perspective of each of us here, working on a different set of diversity issues. But instead of jumping into an individual context immediately, I have a broader question that I'd like to ask everyone here. And that's, you know, we've mentioned the importance of bringing stakeholders together to highlight how research and practice can be connected, to highlight how we need to bring together both these detailed individual experiences and larger data trends. And one of the questions I have is, it's very difficult to create a space where everyone can come together to have these conversations. And that could be due to stigma, whether an individual does not want to, quote unquote, out themselves to participate in these conversations. That could be difficult due to physical barriers of participation. I mean, a very ironic example, when I was in undergrad, I remember the Office of Diversity and Inclusion at my university was up a flight of stairs with no elevator. So, you know, you have these examples of barriers that prevent people from participating. And they look different if you're, let's say, in the need of a prayer room or a lactation space near some of these venues for conversation, or if you have obligations as a parent that might prevent you from participating in conversation. There are so many barriers that might stop us from engaging in these really critical conversations around how the university gathers data, how the university uses that data, and who's involved. So I guess one of the questions I have for you is, have you seen any successful models or failed models of how these conversations play out? And what do you think we can do to more effectively bring stakeholders together to solve some of the DEI issues that are going on today? No pressure, easy question, right? I see Allison's hand. Allison, go ahead.
Thank you. So some of the initiatives and some opportunities that we have going on at our university currently is from an autistic point of view. If I use that as my example, we have one of the university societies is Arch, which is sort of area of resource and communication, a hub, if you like, for our autistic students that maybe require a bit more reassurance or a bit more accessibility in order to access the university. So within Arch, they have the working group, which is made up of the Arch representatives with lived experience, and also members of the university workforce from accommodation, from estates, an academic representative, and they will meet every 2 to 3 months just to kind of thrash out some ideas that have cropped up from their own Arch meetings. So that's a very small example of how the autistic community are trying to feed back into the wider university workforce. Similarly, we've had within our SEND course student groups that have done environmental audits as part of their learning around SEND, and then that has also been fed back as well. But really, I think we need to make sure that this stream of communication isn't just sporadic, but almost ongoing and continuous. So it's that idea of having an open channel of communication for diverse students to be able to continuously feed back their experiences. But that shouldn't just filter outwards and down. It needs to be injected at the top as well. It needs to be going into the managerial and leadership kind of ears, if you like, so that they can become actions and positive changes. But those sorts of initiatives can be, useful.
Thanks so much. Julia?
It's trying to get the little mouse in the right place to unmute at the right time. That is the delay. It's not the time difference between Tokyo and England. One of the things which the United Kingdom universities are required to do is to put in place an access and participation plan. So picking up Alison's last closing comment about where does responsibility lie, and it can't be just individual events or occurrences. The universities have a responsibility to identify how they're going to be creating change, and that has to move from just being a document that again sits on a computer, but actually is transferable into measurable, here we go again, outcomes. So that comes back to one of your earlier questions as well, Mark, that if we've got an access and participation plan, it's the route into university as well as the route through university and the route out of university. And that continuity of that plan from a conversation in a boardroom into practice can also be facilitated by representation from different groups to have their voice heard. So that might be that if you've got a quality discussion group, a curriculum change group, a teaching and learning environment group, a health and safety group, that each board, each group of that meets has representation from different members of across the university. Equally so, that the opportunity to fill roles either at senior management, at teaching levels, or including student union, and most importantly student union representation, is open through gender and diverse members of the community can hold those positions. So it's not a case of us doing things to people, but alongside and being informed by their experiences. So that would be my suggestion. That but equally, you ask for things that don't go so well. I can offer lots of those, but at the moment we're doing a particular drive. We have Wellbeing Wednesdays, so every Wednesday in March we have a range of activities across the university which are directed towards supporting health and well-being and mental health. Curiously, before COVID, student participation in these events was quite high. But what we found this March, although the range of activities is comparable, participation has been lower. So we can't always do what we've always done and expect to get the same results. So we've got to rethink about how we change post-COVID and bringing students out of the rooms where they find a bit of security. And so we've got another agenda, we've got another item to add to the conversation about what we did before was that it wasn't good enough, but it needs to be even better now when we're looking ahead, when people are dealing with other issues, or students. I don't mean to just, yeah, okay.
Thanks so much. You highlight the sort of important dynamic of the COVID shift, and that's something that I'm sure we could talk about for days in terms of the way that transition online, for instance, has enabled and empowered some populations and disempowered others. And I'm happy to bracket that conversation for now. I'm sure it'll come up at some point later today. But I noticed that both Aurora and Yuko have their hands up. So let me jump in with Aurora first, if you don't mind. Aurora? I believe you're on mute.
Sorry about that. I often get asked these questions in relation to what can we do in the classroom as teachers? How can we create safe spaces for our students to talk about, experiences where they don't feel like they fit in, or they don't feel, like they have the same access to resources. And I have to say, I have, two different mindsets about this. I mean, one, we need to talk about this with all of our students. All students need to have an understanding, even if they are, identify as more mainstream type of students. It's so important for faculty and students, everyone, to gain more knowledge about these issues, as well as what it's like, hear the stories of what it's like to walk in another person's shoes. At the same time, like putting minority students on the spot to tell their stories in the classroom is also not something you want to necessarily do. Like you can't force them to come out with these painful experiences. So we have to be very cognizant of that. And for those purposes, I do think it's very important to have safe spaces specifically for people who identify similarly, or who are able to gather like types of resources, people to talk to for the supports they need. But I hate to say this, but each student's case is different, of course, and we have to take that into account. In terms of what we can do in mainstream classrooms, I think this is something we continually think about, but definitely being able to include materials from diverse authors, from have diverse role models, showing students that there are many ways to be and still be successful, valued members of the campus community.
Thanks so much, Aurora. Absolutely, there's this huge question of dealing with issues of lack of awareness on behalf of folks who might not come from the same identity background, the same diversity category. On the one hand, often diverse individuals are asked to represent their entire demographic and almost tokenized in that way. And those tokenization experiences can be problematic in the classroom. While they are educational to some extent, we certainly don't want to put anyone on the spot. And the role of the educator in creating opportunities to have discussion that don't necessarily spotlight the student, but allow the student to contribute if they wish, while still having broader conversation, broader discussion of diversity is definitely something we can do. You mentioned bringing in materials written by or produced by marginalized authors. That's definitely one way to go. There are other strategies here that I think we can talk about as well. But before we jump into the nitty-gritty of pedagogy, I see Yuko has her hand up. So let me call attention to that. Yuko.
Thanks, Mark. I just wanted to offer a little bit of, I suppose, local historical context. I suppose it's not really that long of a history, but I think a few years ago, I had a chance to write about my experience as a female faculty on our campus. And I was really scared to write this because we're a small minority, and I was worried that this is going to impact my promotion and all these other kinds of things, and possibly being ostracized on campus. And so it took a lot of courage, but that was a few years ago, and now I feel like there's more, definitely more space to talk about being a minority. I think in the past, I used to think that entering the main gate of our campus, we used like a lot of people had to kind of shed off or take, or maybe cover up things that made them unique in order to become a member of the campus community. And I think hopefully that's becoming less of an issue. And part of the reason why I think that is because at least at the Komaba campus, there is something called a safe space or safer space where students are able to come and have a conversation. I also feel like the university leadership, echoing what Allison mentioned earlier, the university leadership has explicitly said that diversity, equity, inclusion is an important mission. And having done so, I think it really changes the dial a little bit for everybody to feel like, oh, this is something that not only I can talk about, but I probably should talk about. So I've been very encouraged by that. I haven't been paid by the university to say this, by the way.
Well, thank you so much for that. The importance of local context, it's come out several times kind of in each of our own comments here. I will give a very brief plug from my own perspective as a disability historian in Japan, just to highlight, what this dynamic looks like in a little bit more detail from that end. The last couple of years have been incredibly transformative in terms of legal changes around disability that have led to this type of promotion inside of the university. So in Japan, the first law mandating access to public transportation was passed in 2000, just to give a frame of reference. So, and that was the first law that mandated accessibility in any part of society, right? For universities, the law that mandates reasonable accommodation was enacted in 2016, so a little over 5 years ago. There's a very recent history here, and there are many reasons why that law was passed. I won't go into all the details, but I'll just say because the history is relatively new and still forming, there's a desire to have conversation around what accommodations should look like, who they should be for. And there's increased reason to have those conversations as folks leave the university pipeline and go into the workforce. If we start thinking about connections, let's say with the aging population, how the work that we're doing to create inclusion inside the academy and create an inclusive mindset might then filter out to affect other groups of people in other places who are affected by accessibility issues or inclusion issues. There's been a number of pressures, domestic and international, that are driving this inside of Japan. And I'm sure the case would look different in other parts of the world, but equally important in terms of the lessons that we can learn from each other. And this actually ties back to a question I wanted to ask everyone, which is the relationship between the local and contextualized diversity inclusion experiments that we're seeing now and their global import. So, one thing that's always struck out to me, and again, I'll frame this in light of my own experiences and research for a moment. Japan, because it has had events like the recent Olympic and Paralympic Games, because it has had the aging population problem, because it has had the ratification of UN conventions and other legal structures around diversity and inclusion issues, there are a lot of experiments that are being made inside the university and society more broadly to address diversity issues. So again, speaking from my own perspective as a disability historian, I think about the creation of caregiving robots, for instance, that are made in the Japanese context to address a Japanese problem, but are then being exported to Germany, being exported to Taiwan to address these global crises. And I guess one question I have is, how does the diversity and inclusion initiatives that we're all seeing and working on inside the diversity space affect actors, not just in our immediate vicinity, but beyond as well? Another way of framing this question might be, how do the diversity, equity, and inclusion projects that we're seeing in our context affect individuals outside, whether it's the immediate kind of city around us or it's actors across the world? Do you see those type of connections being drawn in your fields? And if not, is there a reason for that? Or should we even pursue them? It's a lot of questions, but if anyone has any thoughts, I'd be curious to hear more about how the university links up to other spaces. Julia.
Since September 21, I was involved with 11 other universities, and we've been delivering a series of lectures for undergraduate students with regard to the histories of special education in these respective countries. And although there are some presentations which were flagship countries, so we had a presentation from Finland, we had a presentation from America, from Germany, UK. We had some countries which surprised me in terms of their approaches, which included the UAE. And we had interesting conversations with participants from Vietnam. And one of the things that came across very clearly was that, as you have pointed out, that legislation has been quite slow historically in coming forward, but attitudes are improving towards acceptance of differences. But again, we're talking from a very narrow educational field. So in response to your question, what do we see? I've had a brief glimpse into some international practice, which shows that there's changes taking place within education from a school setting in response to meeting the needs of the individual child. How that rolls out into societal change is still a question that we've got to address. So with the kindness that we act upon meeting different needs, I don't know if that sense of inclusion has really been broadly transformational across all aspects globally or nationally. So just a few insights. I'm still optimistic though, still optimistic.
Thanks so much, Julia. Yuko.
Oops,
I
okay.
think you're
So
muted. Yes,
I'm going to offer a critical perspective too, just like Julia, but maybe from a different perspective. I find that the global import narrative is really interesting. It's always been, an important part of the Japanese modern Japanese history, I suppose. But in particular, when it comes to DEI, which I think is kind of under the umbrella of globalization efforts, at least in our context, it's such a complicated and difficult concept. Actually, I feel like sometimes it becomes a bit of a dirty word. There's a bit of a resentment and always a bit of a backlash that happens when we try to import ideas from overseas. And so best practices don't always work in our local context. And when it comes to specifically DEI, I think that some of our students definitely are genuinely interested in what that means for them and how they can use it to make our society inclusive. But I think another part of our student population might also be thinking about it in terms of, okay, corporations are really interested in DEI. I need to learn about this so that I become marketable or valuable, or at least I can talk that language. And so there's a different kind of investment in DEI, I feel, and I just wanted to offer that observation.
Thanks so much. I totally agree, both on the importing and exporting of DEI. There are a number of barriers and a number of hesitancies, let's call them, that I've seen, and in many cases, well justified. I'll give you an example. As an American wheelchair user who uses a big, heavy wheelchair, when I go to Japan, most of the toilets here are too low to the ground for me to use. I'm unable to use them, and that's because they've not necessarily adopted what are international standards for the development of bathrooms in many cases, in many places. Meanwhile, my Japanese friends who go to the US or the UK or somewhere else and are in smaller wheelchairs have the opposite problem. The toilets are all too small, or all too tall rather, so they can't use them. And there's this issue around standards and practices and the reasons why we adopt them that can create problems as well as offer solutions. I mean, that we recognize this is an issue means that we can do something about it. And that's something I think that corporations in Japan, some of them anyway, are starting to recognize and starting to work on. And I'm hopeful, connecting your 2 points, that perhaps as more corporations adopt DEI agendas and more students filter into them who have experiences with a critical approach to DEI inside the university, maybe we'll start to see some of this conversation change, and we'll see more folks in corporations doing more things to link back to the diversity, for instance, or link to other parts of society and facilitate a broader social inclusion. Anyway, I've been talking on that enough, and I see that both Aurora and Allison have their hands up. So let me go to Aurora real fast.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a systemic issue. There's no way to really do justice to your question, but I would like to just maybe focus on just some of the conversations I have with students about, the world conversation we have about race. Black Lives Matter has become such a prominent, well-known issue these past years. And I find that a lot of the students in my courses, when we start talking about race and racism, they come in thinking, a lot of them come in thinking it's mostly an American issue. And I know this isn't something that's, happens only in Japan. It happens in many countries. Like racism is seen as an American issue. And, that's, of course, I have to help expose them to stories from diverse people like Zainichi, Hafu returnees, Ainu, other multicultural Japanese. And, through the course, they usually do start to recognize very different ways that racism does exist, except manifested in, different societal behaviors and cultural norms. So, we really do have to contextualize whatever issue we're talking about and how it relates to students. But, what I think gives me hope is that just so many of my students, they're so open and ready and willing to do the critical thinking. And I think when we talk about like, what is your definition of Japanese or Todai students, most of them are always very much ready to expand their definitions and be as inclusive as possible. So I guess what's most important, I think, in these settings is just giving the opportunity to critically think about these issues. That's something that we can do in the classrooms.
Thanks so much. Allison?
Just responding to what you were saying about the physical barriers for accessibility and being able to travel internationally and have that pathway open to you. From a conversation with a student, they were saying that actually hidden disability is an extraordinary barrier too. And because disability isn't fixed and because her needs have changed through her time at the university, she's now a wheelchair user. And she also has a wellbeing dog companion to support her mental health. And she said that she now actually has a much better sense of inclusion and better responses from her peers around her because her disability has now become visible, and she's been able to have more accessible accommodation, whereas previously she'd been climbing the stairs with her crutches. But my point really is that another layer to our conversation about inclusion is that these international pathways and opportunities to network and to access the world from an educational point of view, they need to be available to our disabled students, whether that disability is a hidden disability or whether it's immediately obvious to the people around them.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And of course, this insight around visible and invisible difference does not just apply to disability. It applies to race, it applies to gender, it applies to class. You know, poverty is around us, but we don't necessarily recognize it as such. These types of insights, I think, are incredibly important. And again, call back to our earlier conversation around creating a space for people to participate, around identifying the stakeholders who need to be involved in these conversations. It's important to recognize that the issues we're trying to solve are not just the most apparent ones. Oftentimes they are systemic and embedded and hidden, and then take a lot of unearthing to figure out. So hopefully, as we're moving forward with conversations around DEI, we'll be thinking as much around what aren't we necessarily thinking of, what have we missed, as well as the issues that we know need to be addressed when building our agendas. So I'm looking at the clock, and I think we have like 5 minutes or so before we said we're going to take our break. So I want to add one last kind of structured question for everyone here. And that's, you know, from your own perspective, if there's one aspect of diversity, equity, and inclusion that we haven't touched on yet in this conversation that you think we ought to be speaking about, what would that be? Julia?
Thank you. That question actually flowed where my mind was going. And for me, it relates, listen to other people's stories, it relates to my story of my niece, who white, female, different sexuality, gendered, has her own female partner, getting ready for marriage, but both of them were doing a doctorate. And her supervisor changed while she was going through her doctorate. She was studying at a very highly respected, internationally respected university. And her new doctorate supervisor compromised her in many different ways, including sexually. And her progress was impeded. As a professional working alongside her, and as a relative, I encouraged, and both understood the difficult situation she was in, but she elected not to raise a complaint because it would jeopardize her doctorate progression. She'd already had a upset program. So I think it's about issues around equality with regard to sexual identity. And again, where we went before about women and men feeling that they're in safe places and they should not be at all compromised in any way in their educational journey. So that's another conversation, a long conversation, but I just wanted it to be part of the, you asked me and I've responded, Mark.
I appreciate it. And if I can kind of touch on one thing here, intersectionality has been kind of hidden underneath everything that we've been talking about today. how difference is not just experienced in terms of, say, gender and sexuality or disability, but rather gender and sexuality and disability, right? That there are compounding identities at play here.
Very much.
And we have to think about how all those intersections inform individual experience, as well as community identity and university action. But with all of that in mind, does anyone else have anything they want to add on this topic? Allison.
I actually raised my hands just as you were saying, anyone want to add anything else on this topic, as I was about to throw something else in. So if anyone else has something that they wish to say on that topic, then please do jump in. No? Sorry, Mark. I can when you asked about was there any other topics that we thought we needed to consider in the context of DEI, I think the idea of assessment during the course, and that when we think of the human rights article about higher education shall be equally accessible to all on the basis of merit, and we have the two different agendas of widening participation whilst maintaining academic standards, I think assessment and the way in which we assess our students is really important, so that we're not, creating further barriers through the type of assessment that we're using, and so that we're finding accessible ways for them to demonstrate aptitude, their ability, intelligence, critical thinking. So that's my extra topic.
Thanks so much. Absolutely. And I think that the development of assessment is incredibly difficult, but incredibly important, right? Figuring out how we're going to track the way things are changing, who's involved in that process, etc. Aurora, Yuko, do you have anything you'd like to add to the conversation? Aurora?
Yeah, I mean, this is related a bit to what Julie was saying, but there are many ways that, minorities are silenced in the issues that they face. And it's just too dangerous to really speak about them, especially in any way that could, implement them or, could endanger their progress at whatever stage they are, whatever position they are. So yeah, I think this is something that needs to be addressed, being able to find a way to give them support either under, an anonymous name or in ways that they feel safe and they're, safe from backlash, I suppose. But this is something I think we need to think very strongly about going forward.
Thank you. I absolutely agree. And not just having ways of preserving that anonymity and safety, but perhaps multiple avenues for doing so, as every individual is going to have their own definition of safety and their own way of establishing a communication network. Yuko.
Thank you. I just wanted to add on something. I think when it comes to our conversation about stakeholders in the university, I tend to just directly talk about what happens in the classroom or amongst my my colleagues, but I think also who's also put in a really difficult position, I think, are the administrators, the staff at our university, because our all universities, I suppose all universities do have this tendency, but our staff are really trained to follow regulations and rules. And I think if they wanted to have a critical voice, I think it's awfully difficult. So how do we make a safe space for them to also voice their opinions and think about how things can be improved is another topic at some point that we can discuss.
Yes, thank you so much for that insight. Absolutely. I mean, given the focus of the conversation today is kind of centered around teacher-student interactions, I think it's important to recognize that there are so many other players involved in the institutional setting, whether we're talking about academic administrators, whether we're talking about staff, whether we're talking about even, family members or parents of students as well, right? There are many individuals involved in the ecosystem who need to have their own reporting systems, their own modes of accommodation and communication in place. And that's worth discussing. But having said that, I'm cognizant of the time, and I think we should take a brief break for all of our sakes. And then in around, let's say 8 minutes, so 6:20, we'll come back and open up the floor for audience questions. So I'd invite everyone to sit back and take a short respite until then. Thank you for listening so far, and looking forward to speaking to you in the second half. welcome back. I'm looking at the clock and it is 6:20. So why don't we take this time to open up the floor to questions from our audience, if our speakers are ready for that. Good, okay. So if anyone has any questions, I suppose if I could ask you to either raise your hand, put them in chat, or submit them privately to either Cecilia or myself so we can voice them in whatever way you find comfortable submitting your questions. Feel free to do so, and we will answer them. You're welcome to turn your camera on as you ask, but you're certainly not required to by any means. So while we're waiting on questions to populate, I have a question I'd like to ask everyone. Not that I've not been bothering you with enough questions already, but I'm curious. One thing that kind of came up multiple times in our conversation earlier was practices that we can use in the classroom or in starting conversations with our university that might help further some of our DEI initiatives. And I know, for example, Aurora mentioned using materials from marginalized authors. We had discussion around creating safe spaces in university settings that would enable conversations that might not happen otherwise. But I'm curious, does anyone here have any practices that they would recommend for starting DEI conversations, either inside or outside of the classroom? Allison, go for it.
Just from my sort of day-to-day experience, we found that making ourselves routinely available to students, either at the beginning of lectures or towards the ends of lectures, or by continuously welcoming email communication, which might be more comfortable for some students, that we've tried to keep those channels of communication open. But one comment that came from one of the students I spoke to last week was around that they didn't always know what questions they needed to be asking, or indeed what sort of support they should be looking to access. And if that is the case, which I think probably often is, then actually it's not enough just to provide opportunities for our students. We need to be ensuring that those opportunities are being accessed, and that the students have the support to access the support. So I think in that, if we're going to achieve that, we need to have very strong relationships, very strong sense of welcome and belonging and acceptance, so that you know, we can ensure that our students are accessing the things that are available to them, and that they're aware of that.
Aurora.
Yeah, you know, actually, I'm reminded of something that you said in the talk you gave, I guess, last semester, about how sometimes, you know, students don't necessarily want to out themselves about certain disabilities they have or certain identities they have. And I remember, yeah, sometimes it might be helpful, as you suggested, like giving a private survey between teacher and student to let them optionally, you know, talk about any things that might relate to their learning experience in your course that you should know about, and to ensure that, you know, it'll be kept private if they want that to be kept private. Some other things that I've seen done and successfully include providing ground rules for conversations that are difficult. So, rules like we are going to respect everybody's experiences, and we're not going to provide invalidating comments saying like, are you sure it wasn't just you, these kind of invalidating comments. But of course, ground rules for safe conversations is something that you can look up in Google and try to find more resources for, because there's many, depending on the context, that would be appropriate. And also, starting with your syllabus, making sure that you provide information to all students about all of the different resources that are available to them. That's something that I find oftentimes students and faculty alike don't even know about. So yeah, those are just a few things that come to mind.
Thank you so much. I'm flattered that you remember the confidential recommendation form that I mentioned last year. I think that those forms are incredibly important. And I want to add on one quick comment about your recommendation for syllabus construction, because I think this is something that we can all do as instructors, which is, in addition to including information about university resources, whether it's the Office of Student Disability Services or gender inclusive spaces on campus, into our actual syllabi, I really want to emphasize that the placement of that information on your syllabus is incredibly important. So too often I've seen accessibility statements at the bottom of syllabi where you've read through your course requirements, you've read through the assignments, you've read through the policy on cheating or whatever it might be, and then you get to the very end and it's, oh, if you need resources for inclusion, this is where you need to go. That information does not belong at the bottom of your syllabus. It belongs further up, because it's that type of accessibility and inclusion that's going to make the course assignments possible. That's going to make your participation in various ways in the classroom possible. So I'd encourage us each to think about how we include that accessibility or inclusion information into our syllabus and course design. It shouldn't be an afterthought. It should be something that we use to structure our curriculum. With that said, I see that Julia has her hand up. I apologize if I've gone too far off course, but Julia, you have something you'd like to say?
I do, but I noticed there's a comment in the chat first, so I'm happy to wait to see, or however you want to play it, Mark.
Sure, I can touch on this comment. So the comment is, generally speaking, how receptive are Japanese university faculty with regard to providing accommodations or modifications for students with disabilities in their classrooms? Okay, switch the hats to my disability inclusion hat for a moment. Let me say, the conversation has been changing rapidly over the last couple of years. When I first got to Japan in 2008, there was no legal precedent or requirement for universities and individual professors to respond to students' needs. I had a very hard time. According to the Ministry of Education, I was the first wheelchair user ever to study abroad in Japan in a wheelchair. So that created a lot of problems in terms of barriers. Those persist. With that said, because it is now a legal requirement, we're seeing to provide reasonable accommodations to students, we're seeing more and more universities start to adapt infrastructures to do that. That includes building offices for barrier-free support, offices of disability inclusion that then interact directly with professors on students' behalves or independently of students to make sure that the entire university ecosystem is more accessible for the students when they get there. With that said, there's still a lot of burden on the students to speak to their professors and identify what their needs are and negotiate accommodations. In theory, that would not be necessary or could create problems, right? If you're asking the student to tell you exactly what they need, Well, the student may not even know what they need in the classroom because they haven't taken your course before. They can't anticipate what assignments you're going to give them. And it could be uncomfortable for them to tell you what they need. They might not necessarily have that information. So discussions with professors in university settings are very difficult. And like I said, they are starting to be mediated by these university structures like Office of Disability Services, but it's an emerging conversation. To give you just a little bit of a statistic off the top of my head, currently 1% of students enrolled at universities in Japan identify as disabled. So most professors, most university admin have very little experience interacting with students with disabilities and navigating these conversations. So they can be unsure as to what they should provide and how to provide them. I'm hopeful that over the next couple of years, as that number increases because of the recent legal changes, because of the recent societal and attitudinal changes, we'll have more examples and we'll have more data to draw on regarding how to reduce the burden on both the student and the professor. But generally speaking, I can say that attitudes have been improving. They're not perfect, and I won't pretend they are, but we are seeing more efforts to facilitate inclusion. So if anyone else has anything they want to add on that particular question, I'm happy to open up the floor. Otherwise, we can turn to Julia. Okay, Julia.
Okay, so just picking up some of your comments, Mark, and maybe informing my answer here. Students coming into UK universities have on admissions the opportunity to self-declare different status, different disabilities, different needs, identity, etc. And that is fed into our student advice systems. And I think as lecturers, and I'm not sure who my audience is here, but we have a responsibility to be using that information that people have chosen to share with us, to be aware that are we teaching a subject or are we teaching students? And to get the balance right and to be mindful that although we can be informed of issues that students have presented to us openly, there can be other students in our class who have chosen not to share that information. So in our planning, we are being informed by those issues which have been identified, but also trying to be aware of those which are still hidden. And it includes looking at accommodation, the classroom, the heating in the room, the light space, and to be brave to challenge some of the processes that are in place if the spaces that you've been allocated are not the right space for the student group that you're knowing that you're going to be working with. But also to be mindful of the materials that we use. And we can very casually, repeatedly use the resources we've used year on year, but not adapting that to meet the needs of the changing student population that we're working with. And that also reflects the language which we use in the classroom. So to be considerate of those who are recipients of our knowledge, but also to be encouraging their openness to be sharing their experiences so we can adapt our teaching. So the point I'm trying to make is that we're not just teaching a subject, we are actually teaching students. And I think that's how we've got to get the balance right as we move forward.
Thank you so much. I just noticed another question come in, so I'd like to read that now, if I may. The question is, in Indonesia, currently sexual harassment from teacher in university or school is becoming a global issue. Sometimes the victim already tells the other teacher, but the harassment can still occur. May I know, are there any sexual harassment issues in Japan? If yes, how does the university or Japanese government handle this? I'm happy to jump in, but if anyone else wants to take this first, you go, by all means.
I'm happy to take a first stab here. I think, first of all, there are serious issues with sexual harassment in Japan, in academia as well. And there's been, I think in the past few years, it's become, the universities have become much better at dealing with it. One indication of that is that you see more cases in the newspaper of like official reprimand or firing of faculty members because of some kind of sexual harassment or academic harassment. And I think I'm not saying though that it's perfect at all. I think there's a lot of problems with the way that sexual harassment allegations are being handled in the university. It's quite a complicated issue, I feel, partly because there's so many, because the faculty are meant to have autonomy and a lot of say in the way that the university is governed. They are on all different kinds of committees, and I think rather than relying on expertise, there's a lot of kind of conversations that happened that might not be as informed as it can be. So I think that's one thing. But having said that, there are some improvements that are, or not improvements, but some projects or strategies to try to address these. For example, I noticed that the university offered a video series, a training video of sorts, where they basically have a lawyer talking about what is considered academic harassment or sexual harassment. The problem that I had with that set of videos is that they were talking primarily about how not to get into trouble. And so the positionality of obviously is aimed at certain kinds of people amongst the faculty community. And so there's a lot of problems with it, but at least there's some willingness to address it.
Thank you. I have questions, I suppose, around accountability, but it looks like I just got a private message from someone who would like to speak, so I want to call them out. So we have here Jackie Steele. Jackie, you have something you'd like to say?
Sure, and I mean, generally, I just want to thank the panelists for the discussion, and also Mark for the moderation here today. I'm really excited to see this kind of discussion actually emerging at the University of Tokyo. I spent 6 years as an associate professor between 2012 and 2019, and at the time, I must say, it was quite isolating. There was really not a lot of other, particularly not a lot of other feminists on faculty that I could connect to. Certainly not a lot of out professors that I could connect to and who identified as women who were openly out and queer. And I certainly had an experience for my first couple of years as a single mother and professor in Tokyo, which was of course challenging to be juggling as a longtime immigrant in Japan. Nonetheless, it adds a whole other layer. So I think what I'm quite impressed is just even in the space of the last, I guess, 4 years, it seems like there maybe has been a bit of a pivot or shift to more meaningfully engage with these topics. And myself, I've been working as a feminist political scientist for the last 15 years, both in Canada and Japan. And I really literally had to go to find collaborators outside of the University of Tokyo to find partners to research, do collaborative research with, to build funding grant applications with. There just wasn't a lot of space for the topics of diverse citizenship that I was focused on as a political scientist. It was seen as outside of what political scientists and law scholars do, in fact. And so I was often met with kind of a confused look like, so you do something about women? And I would sort of respond, well, actually, diversity is core to Canadian political science at a minimum, and it's core to international political science and the way that we convene internationally with robust communities on these topics of law and policy and diversity mainstreaming. So just seeing this conversation some 4 years later, and the professors who are in the room here speaking is really tremendously exciting. So that was my main first comment. Certainly, I've pivoted out of academia in many ways because it was so isolating, frankly. And I just felt like if I wanted to be able to engage with leaders in Japan who want to move the dial in all spaces across not just the university system, but also corporations, organizations, nonprofit, civil society. I actually felt I wasn't having a lot of luck as a political scientist, even though I was a University of Tokyo associate professor, which you'd think would open doors. The policy conversations and circles were very closed. And the irony is that in putting on a CEO hat of my company of Enjoy Japan is sort of building education, executive education and training around equity and diversity and equity for innovation and inclusive innovation and well-being at work for teams. But really wearing a CEO hat would open a door and people would want to talk about diversity all of a sudden. Whereas if I introduced myself as a political scientist at the University of Tokyo, they were it was just sort of academic and they were not really interested, which I found shockingly wonderful in terms of the pivot I've done towards practitioner role. But also I find we need to, I think, get the message out that the research that you're doing and the research that we do as sociologists and political scientists and in computer science or whatever the fields we're in around diversity has transferable knowledge for society and for corporate leaders and for organizations. And then to have the rest of those Japanese leaders be open to the conversation and the thought diversity from academics who are engaged in these topics. And I guess that's the one thing, my main comment is thought diversity. I didn't find a lot of it at the University of Tokyo at the time when I was there, and there wasn't a lot of curiosity for thought diversity, and certainly around DEI topics, there was not a lot of openness. And I think also on the corporate side, we need corporate leaders to be open to learning from academics and the research communities that are vibrantly building the research track record and the evidence of why we need to keep talking about these topics and building a multi-stakeholder community view, 360-degree practitioner, civil society, academics, researchers, corporate leaders, policymakers, bureaucrats, local to national. I think that's maybe the next move that I hope we can move forward on and collaborate on. And certainly that's what we're trying to do through Enjoy Japan's work. But certainly the irony is I'm getting called to universities to do professional development for different universities, which I enjoy doing. And at the same time, sometimes it stays in a bubble. It's professional development and it's a one-off workshop and then it's done. And people go on with their day and it gets washed away. So I guess I would love to hear your views, the panel's views. How do we make it something that's more than just knowledge transfer? Because we can teach a lot of knowledge transfer, it doesn't change behavior. And we know that, but then how do we move to a more experiential engagement with these topics?
Thanks so much for the question. I have a lot of thoughts on this, both as a professor and a consultant, but before I kind of chime in, Allison, I see you have some comments.
A brief comment, and it takes me back to a conversation we had prior to this event today, Mark, about your idea of blossoming and the blossoming of access and inclusion. And it's not until really those blossoms are fully open across the board that we will achieve this inclusion. And, we might get some bits very, very right in our approach to access and inclusion. But if there still remain flowers that are closed, tightly closed, then it's those that are not open that can create the barriers which will still hold people back and will still restrict people from achieving their potential, whether it's within the ring-fenced university, the ring-fenced institution, or whether it's in the wider community nationally. So it was just really to flag your metaphor of blossoming.
Thank you so much. Let me go ahead and unpack that metaphor for the audience here who was not privy to our conversation. When I have this idea of blossoming, that's how I tend to think about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And by blossoming, I mean we can think about every sector of society as being connected in some way. So if I leave my home and get on the train, then the train leads to my school. The school, I get education that qualifies me for employment. When I have employment, I have money, and that means I can use it on entertainment. When I have entertainment, I'm living a life, I'm able to survive to a certain extent. Maybe I need medical care along the way. Every different part of society connects, and it doesn't just connect at the individual level, it connects across cities. What I do in one city could relate to where I go in the next city. It could relate to the country. It could relate internationally. And we've talked about today how different people of different diversities move across different spaces, whether it's international exchange in education or otherwise. But this type of blossoming metaphor of a flower blooming and all these parts of society expanding essentially means the more transportation access we have, the more the school changes. The more the school changes, the more the employment sector changes. And we're seeing this transformation of both academia and industry, which might relate to what Jackie was mentioning a couple of minutes ago in terms of this recent change and the fact that we're having this conversation right now as inside of the infrastructure of the University of Tokyo, hopefully will lead to further changes in industry because we're now getting students and educators trained in how to think about or talk about these topics and bring them to their next venue, whether it's a job somewhere else or living in a different city, whatever it might be. But picking up more specifically on Jackie's question around what the university and corporations can do to learn from each other or how they can learn from each other. I think that there's one thing that I've noticed in my own experience as a consultant that I'm curious if it's shared by anyone here. And that's, when I go and talk to the International Paralympic Committee or the Chambers of Commerce, I'm an academic who's being invited into these spaces to give corporate talks. When I engage in those talks, the stakeholders are decided and the conversation structure is fairly limited. On the other hand, I don't necessarily see a reverse flow as much. I don't necessarily see stakeholders from corporations being invited into the diversity space to join us in thinking about how a DEI transfer might look from our perspective into theirs. And while it's starting to happen and we are seeing more interest in those type of conversations, I'm wondering if the university has the opportunity as an institution that trains individuals in almost every discipline imaginable to start bringing in corporate involvement and not just going there, so to speak, but making it an integral part of what we do as well. So that bridge is firmed up and DEI carries over from one space to the next. Yuko, I see your hands up. You have something you wanted to add on this?
I do, but Julia had her hand up first, I think.
Oh, sorry, Julia, your hand's been up for a while. I wasn't sure if that was a glitch or not.
No, it was a lazy hand, but it still stayed up. I think it's very easy for us, and Jackie, you've brought it to my mind. It's very easy for us, here I am at 10 to 9, 10 to 10, whatever time it is in the UK, and we're having a very nice civilized conversation, a gentle response to what I think is a very challenging issue. And I think majority of us are a little bit like swans, we're sort of swimming along, but underneath we've been going really crazy. And my statement is, yes, I have had very many angry conversations with both senior directors and colleagues, some of which I'm not really always proud of, but I needed to make a point, and the only way I could get that frustration out in order to create change was to be that person that I was at the time. And I usually got the retort of, oh, you're one of those, aren't you? And I would respond to that, and I would get even more agitated. But then I started to think, no, I'm going to own that. I'm going, yes, I am. Thank you. You know, I am one of those. I believe in creating change. And if I have to do it through a quiet voice or a loud voice, then I'm prepared to do that. But I've also come to realize from the impetuous nature of youth to the more stoic presentation of being aged, is that people don't need to be informed of what they're doing wrong, but need to be opened up to what they could do differently. And I think that's what this conversation has been about, isn't it? It's about how can we approach these issues differently, and probably accept the ripples, rather than what I used to do was I wanted a tsunami. That's very Japanese, isn't it? Do you like how I brought that in? We're going with the nature metaphors here. But yes, I think we have all met times when we've just been very, very angry with way that either ourselves or we've seen others being treated. And yeah, let's go forward with these conversations and see how we can collectively make some differences for other people across our community. So my hand's now down, Mark.
Thank you so much. And I apologize again for missing your hand earlier. Yuko.
Yes, thank you. I was going to say something quite similar to what Julia was saying, which is, I think, Jackie, I don't know, Aurora, about you, but I'm definitely painting a rosier picture than I probably should. But I'm also self-censoring, knowing that the recording button is on right there, and I don't want any trouble later as well. So I think I'm able to talk like this because this is an English language event, and that if this were a Japanese language event, I probably wouldn't even be here. So there are certain tensions, and also, you know, when it comes to this kind of conversation, I think we're all pretty much drinking the same kind of Kool-Aid, whereas there are plenty of people who disagree, especially when it comes to things like meritocracy. What does merit mean? What is fair when it comes to admissions? These kinds of conversations can be very emotional. So I just want to mention that of course there's some progress for sure, but it's not perfect at all.
Thanks so much. Jackie, you wanted to respond?
Sure, and thank you. And I appreciate that, you know, these are challenging conversations for people who are currently employed by the University of Tokyo. And I really think that needs to be on record. And to Aurora's point earlier, I was an associate professor on a 6-year contract. There is no permanency. So there is no ability to feel job security, that you actually have academic freedom. And you have the freedom to take on some of these issues or challenges, or be the squeaky wheel, because you're coming up for review and there are no guarantees. And so, you know, as much as I've been tracking, you know, what's happening in Japanese national university systems, I started out at the University of Tohoku. It was even more closed than the University of Tokyo, probably. And then at the University of Tokyo, it really was more, I just felt tolerated. I was left in my corner to do my research on diversity and intersectionality and diverse citizenship and public policy, and sort of glazed eyes as I would speak about my research agenda. And everyone very polite. And if they needed somebody to come and speak about diversity, to trot out some kind of a diversity or gender angle, they would call me. And otherwise, you're sort of left to be tolerated. And I think there's a very big difference in Canadian political science. We very much talk about the chilly climate syndrome. And the chilly climate is exactly that you actually feel that it's chilly and you're being tolerated. And I think the other challenge that I see in the Japanese National University system is who was doing the emotional labor and carrying the mental load. And the emotional load for all of these issues, and often it is the foreign faculty, it is the women faculty, it is the faculty who are experiencing these lived experience of marginalization. And so you're not only responsible for doing your research agenda and trying to have career mobility, you're also put on every single committee and every single diversity inclusion initiative, and called out for the interview for the GFD-UTokyo people feature that they want to show that there are women's faces. So these are things that layer on extra work on top of your actual role as academics, and that undermine your actual time freedom, and particularly if you're also parenting. Wow, it's just a lot. And so thinking about, I think, structurally within the university system, that the bringing in sort of professionals, and I'm not just trying to say this to have you hire my company. I literally believe that you need to have external neutral parties who are experts in the field of intersectional diversity across multiple complexities, and who can be a check on the administration to say, this is what this is the diagnosis, and I'm not going to sugarcoat it for you. This is the diagnosis, and then are we going to make progress? How do you want to make progress? What are the KPIs you're setting? How are you going to be accountable? How are you going to measure? Because anyone who is in a non-tenured contract position cannot have that freedom to speak truth to power, or just even to say their squeaky wheelness. And so they're silenced in many ways, structurally, by no one's fault, but structurally. And even for tenured professors or on the tenure track, you're worried about the review committee and who you come up against, your peers who are evaluating you. And so we need to have insider, outsider stakeholders who can also be partners with the university, so that it's not all falling on the non-tenured faculty, project-based faculty, and people for whom this is your research agenda. It may not be your personal vocation in life and life's passion to be advocates for this, right? You might just want to do this as your research agenda, and I think that's fair too. I don't think we can assume that everybody has to be the political advocate for this inside the university simply because it's your research agenda. And I think that's a slippery slope too in terms of emotional load that I see so many historically sort of, I guess, in the underrepresented groups among faculty carrying those burdens, and that trickles down to the postdocs and to the graduate students and to the actual undergraduate students who are trying to carve out safe space on campus too. So I think these structural issues are challenging, but I think all the same, I will admit this is interesting to see this conversation. And the professional development that has been happening is very encouraging, to say the least.
Thanks so much for that, Jackie. I'm going to add one quick thing that I think we have to move towards wrapping up. And what I want to add is this. There are many structural issues inside the university, inside the tenure hierarchy, inside the reporting structures, that make it difficult to talk about certain issues, either publicly in forums like this or privately behind closed doors. One of the problems with bringing in experts from outside that I've seen so far, and this hints back at something I was talking about earlier in terms of bringing in corporations, is you set up an example for someone to say, oh, we've sought the expert's opinion. We now know all the answers. We don't have to do anything else. This is sufficient. We are now diverse, equitable, and inclusive. When in reality, it's an ongoing process. Any answer you get from any expert is not going to cover the entire gamut of diversity, and it's not going to address all the institutional issues. So the conversation around inclusion has to be ongoing. The stakeholders have to be many and multiple. And all of us here, from our own perspectives, from our own roles, have a reason to be a part of that ongoing conversation. So I think it's the issues that you've raised in terms of the censorship inside of academia are real. But it's important to recognize that the answers that are out there are many and varied as well. And we should be pursuing as many avenues as possible to include as many individuals as possible in creating a better ecosystem, or at least that's my thoughts on the matter anyway. But with that said, I'm looking at the clock and it is 7 o'clock exactly. So I am going to turn the mic back to Cecilia, but before I do, I just personally like to thank all the panelists, all of our audience members for joining this conversation. It's been really enlightening. And as I said at the beginning, this is not an end-all be-all for diversity and inclusion conversations. This is a starting point. And I think that we've highlighted many important issues today. So thank you for joining us. And Cecilia, it's all yours.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and thank you for listening all the way. And